Hello you guys. So this is part 4, guys. Again, we're covering in these parts the Old and New Testament, guys, the contents, and we're also talking about the introduction and outline of all of the books, and we're going in order. So I'm just going to continue on. If you missed anything or you want to recap, please visit the other videos, like the different parts before this one, to kind of get where we've already come from and what's happening. But I'm going to continue on. We're in on the book of Zephaniah now, getting ready to go into the New Testament after a few more with this, but we're still in the Old Testament, but we're getting into the New Testament. So we're just going to keep doing the introduction and outline the contents. Okay, guys, so Zephaniah, and I believe we have a Zephaniah series as well, but introduction to Zephaniah. Zephaniah's ministry is dated in the reign of Josiah, which was 640 through 609 BC. He warned that the day of the Lord would bring judgment on Judah and Jerusalem, and he called the Jews to return to God. Zephaniah then predicted that Judah's neighboring nations would be destroyed as well. With a note of hope, he promised that God would bring his people home. And it's fairly short, guys. It has 3 chapters. Even though they're short, if they're short or long, it's still important. And it's in the Bible for a reason. So to outline the contents, chapters 1 going into 2 is God's judgment announced. Chapter 2, like from verse 4 to 15, is judgment against the nations. And chapter 3 talks about the future of Jerusalem. So that's the book of Zephaniah. Haggai is the next one after that. Introduction for Haggai. 18 years had passed since Cyrus's decree in 538 BC had allowed the Jews to return from exile to Jerusalem. Because they were busy building their own homes, the people still had not finished building God's temple. Haggai's message was that the time had come to build the house of the Lord. I'm not sure if we read all this, but I believe we came from it before. Don't remember when, but excuse me, we did do a Bible study on it. Okay, so back to this. So it's time. Haggai's message was that the time had come to build the house of the Lord. Under the leadership of Zerubbabel and Joshua, and with Haggai's prodding, the temple was rebuilt during the years 520 through 515 BC. Haggai told the people that the glory of the temple they were building would be greater than that of the former temple, even though the building itself would be less to look at. This temple would be greater because God would fill this house with his glory. And the outline of contents for this, guys, it only has 2 chapters, but chapter 1 talks about the call to rebuild the temple, and then 2 talks about hopes for the new temple, promised blessings, and God's final triumph. So that's they only have those 2 chapters, so that's what it talks about. Zechariah, I believe we do have a Zechariah series. I know we've come from a lot with reading like chapter 2, 3, and 4, but I believe we do have a series on it. But Zechariah, introduction. Zechariah's prophecies began 2 months after Haggai's first message, 520 BC. In his opening message, Zechariah warned the people who had just begun rebuilding the temple that they were to listen to God's message through the prophets. They were also to keep a close relationship with God so that there would be no further judgment. This opening message is followed by visions that offered encouragement to the builders at a time when they were ready to give up. Zechariah comforted them by telling them God had a long-range plan for Israel. In chapters 7 and 8, Zechariah called the people to obey God by acting fairly and mercifully to one another. God wanted obedience in his relationship with them. Chapters 9 through 14 tell of the coming Messiah, the last judgment, and the long-range growth on the final kingdom. So outline the contents for Zechariah. Chapter 1 is the call to obedience, like return to the Lord and stuff. Chapters like 1 going into 6, the call to obedience is like the first 6 verses. Then chapter 1 verse 7 going into chapter 6, so like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 is visions. Obedience versus legalism is 7 going into 8. Chapter 9 is judgment on Israel's enemies. In chapters 9 through 14 is the coming of Zion's king. So that's the book of Zechariah. And then after Zechariah, the last book in the Old Testament is Malachi. So the first book in the Old Testament is Genesis, and the last book is Malachi. So Malachi Introduction, I know we've come from here as well. It has 4 chapters. No, I'm sorry. It has 4 chapters here. It has 4 chapters. So the outline of contents, guys, because Zechariah actually has 14 chapters, you guys. I believe I told you guys that. Yeah, through 14. And Malachi has 4 chapters, but on the contents, it doesn't. Okay, I see. Okay, Malachi Introduction. This book records the messages of the prophet Malachi, who lived during the second half of the 5th century BC, after the temple had been rebuilt. The Jews' religious life was not in good condition. They had married foreign women, failed to give God what they should have, and even loved God. Malachi's chief concern was that the Israelites' relationship to God was not as it should be. They had forgotten God and treated him with dishonor. They failed to do what God required of them. Because of this, there would be judgment. But the God-fearing people did not need to worry because they were in God's book and would enjoy God's salvation forever. So chapter 1 is God's love for Israel. And also it talks about some other things. Chapters 1 through 2 is Israel insults God. And then chapters 2 through 4 is God's judgment and promise. So that's Malachi. It's short. It only has like 4 chapters, but it talks about a lot of good things. So that's all Old Testament. Now we're about to get into the New Testament. Like I said, with the New Testament, you got the synoptic gospels. You got different epistles being written to different churches, different letters, different movements of apostleship and the disciples and movements of Christ and different things, right? So the book of Matthew, I don't think we've read all of Matthew, but I know we've read a lot of chapters from the book of Matthew. I don't think we've read all of Mark, but we've read from Mark. We have read Luke. We have read John. We have read the book of Acts. I believe we read the book of Romans. If not, we've read from Romans. We have read from 1st and 2nd Corinthians. We have read from Galatians. We have read from Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. There's 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. I think we read those. Philemon and Titus we've read. Timothy we've read. We've come from Timothy. For some of these, we have a full Bible study where we've read all of it. For some of it, we may have just read just a few chapters, but we have visited it from both Old and New. Hebrews, we have read from Hebrews. We have a Bible study on James. Peter, we do have it because it's 1st and 2nd Peter. All the Johns we've read, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, and we do have one on Revelation. Like I said, guys, some of it has been over years, like over 4 years of us reading, so you know, it's taking some time, but we're still learning. We haven't read all of it. There's still a lot I have to learn and read. But we are going to revisit the book of Revelation as well, because we came from it, I think, back in 2019. So we're going to come from it again sometime this year. But let's just get back into Matthew. So introduction for Matthew. The book of Matthew tells of the good news that the long-awaited Messiah had come to save people, both Jews and Gentiles. Because there was a big barrier with them in a lot of people's perception. They felt like they were better, or they felt like, and then dealing with culture and background beliefs, but Christ was coming to deal with the barrier, if you will. Not trying to get into a Bible study, but because we have Bible studies to talk about this, but he's coming to save both Jews and Gentiles. Okay, so Matthew, one of the 12 disciples, is believed to be the author of this book. It was probably written sometime before the Romans destroyed the temple in Jerusalem in AD 70. Although Mark and Luke also wrote about Jesus' life, Matthew's gospel has some special things that are different from the others. Because you got to think, too, they're talking to different audiences, and they will give different details. Like, they may say one story, but it may give it in different details because they're talking to different audiences, and they're giving it from different perspectives, right? So... okay, so although Mark and Luke also wrote about Jesus' life, Matthew's gospel has some special things that are different from the others. Getting back to this, Matthew uses much of the gospel to show that Jesus is the promised Messiah of the Old Testament. Matthew quotes the Old Testament often and uses the phrase kingdom of heaven from the Old Testament frequently. Because of this, many people think he was writing his gospel to Jewish people. Matthew also presents Christ as the great teacher who helps us understand God's law and tells the people about the kingdom of God and what it is. Most of Christ's teachings are found in the following 5 places. So first is the Sermon on the Mount, is in chapters 5 through 7. Instruction to the disciples, number 2, which is chapter 10, 10 Teaching through parables is number 3, which is like chapter 13. Number 4, the meaning of discipleship is chapter 18. Number 5 listed here, teachings about the end of time and the coming of the kingdom of heaven. We have come from there lots of times also. That's chapters 24 through 25. So that's introduction. So here's outline of contents. And it has like 28 chapters. It's lengthy, it's detailed. If you've never read it, I encourage you to read it. Or if you're like, I'm not a big reader, then get into an audiobook. They have free audiobooks on YouTube and just free audiobooks that'll read it to you, you know, and or just listen to it and just be blessed. So outline the contents. Chapters 1 through 4 is background and preparation. It talks about some other things also. Chapter 5 is the Galilean ministry. Chapter 5, continuing on through 7, is the Sermon on the Mount. The ministry through miracles is chapters 8 through 10. Teaching through parables is 11 through 13. Opposition and withdrawal is 13 through 16. 16 through 18 is Jesus as the Son of God. The final period is chapters 19 through 28. Also 19 talks about toward Jerusalem, 19 through 20. I'm reading it as it's stated in the book, guys. The triumphal entry is chapter 21. Christ as teacher is also chapter 21 going through 25. Trial, death, and burial is chapters 26 through 27. And chapter 28 talks about resurrection and ascension. So that's Matthew. After Matthew is Mark. Introduction for Mark. So Mark, the author of this gospel, probably was the first to write down the events of Jesus' life. It is believed that he is the same person who worked for many years as a missionary with Paul and Barnabas. Because some people say John Mark, some people say Mark. We do have for May of last year, our theme was studying the life of Jesus, his sayings, his words, his parables, and we looked at all of the disciples, like all of the main disciples. We looked at them, like the original ones. We looked at them. So we did talk about him already, so I'm going to keep reading. But yeah, it's believed that he is the same person who worked for many years as a missionary with Paul and Barnabas. The book of Mark, which stresses facts and actions rather than themes or topics, is the most exciting account of the life of Christ among the Gospels. Although it is the shortest of the 4 Gospels, excuse me guys, it is often the most detailed. From the beginning, Mark tells the stories of Christ's ministry, especially his miracles. Mark shows Jesus as a man of action and authority. He spends 1/3 of the book telling the events of Christ's last week on earth, ending with the Savior's death and resurrection. So guys, Mark has like 16 chapters. And chapter 1 is background and preparation. Also talking about like John the Baptist prepares to win some other stuff. Chapters 1 continuing on going through 8 is ministry of healing and teaching. Jesus and his disciples is 8, continuing on going into 10. 10 going into 13 is Jericho and Jerusalem. Passion and death of Christ is 14 through 15. And 16 is the resurrected Christ and his followers. So that's for the book of Mark. Next after Mark is Luke. It's Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. So next is Luke. Luke, introduction. Luke, the longest of the Gospels, was written by the same author as the book of Acts. Luke's writing shows him to be a highly educated man who wrote from a Greek background and viewpoint. Luke tells us in the first 4 verses of his book that he wrote this gospel so we will have the true and complete story of Jesus' life. He wrote the fullest, most orderly story of his life. One of Luke's interests in writing this book was to show that Jesus loved all kinds of people. He often wrote about and identified by name the women Christ met and spoke to. He also gave more attention to children than any other gospel writer. In the parables especially, he wrote about the poor and oppressed. Jesus is shown by Luke as an actual person in history who came to seek and to save what was lost. And that's chapter 19, verse 10. The theme of joy is felt throughout this book. From the song of Mary and later the angels at Jesus' birth to the disciples who returned to Jerusalem with great joy after Christ's ascension. It is obvious that Luke wanted to tell the good news of Christ and show that his coming brought joy as well as hope and salvation to a sinful world. So outline the contents for this guy's introduction is chapter 1. 1 going into 2 is the birth and childhood of John the Baptist and Jesus, right? You know they were cousins. 3 is ministry of John the Baptist. 3 going into 4, it talks about Jesus' baptism and temptation. Jesus' teaching and healing ministry is chapters 4 through 9. Jesus' mission is 9 through 18. Suffering and crucifixion of Jesus is chapters 18 through 23. And then resurrection and ascension is 24. And again, it gives a lot more details as you read. You know, like as you go through each one, it'll give you like more details on it. So guys, after Luke is John. It's John. And John has like 21 chapters. Introduction. The fourth gospel was also written by one of Jesus' 12 disciples, John, the disciple whom Jesus loved. John wrote this gospel sometime between 80, 90 through 100, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name, according to John 20:31. Although the book of John gives a general outline of the life and work of Jesus Christ, it is very different from the other 3 gospels. John reports 5 miracles that are not reported by the other gospels. Only 2 of the miracles reported in the other gospels are reported in John. This book contains no parables and seems to stress Jesus' relationships with individuals. The purpose of this gospel is to report the signs, usually called miracles, in other gospels. The signs that John reports give proof that Christ is God and has supernatural powers. Although John gives much attention to proving that Jesus is the Son of God, he also shows often that Jesus was very much a human by showing that he was tired, sad, hungry, and loving. So the outline of contents for this, you guys, prologue and theme is chapter 1, like the first 18 verses. Chapters 1 continuing on going into 4 is the introduction of Jesus. Chapter 5 going into 10 is Jesus' ministry as God's Son. Crisis in Jerusalem is chapters 11 through 12. Chapters 13 through 17 is Jesus with his disciples. Trial, death, and burial is 18 through 19. And resurrection and conclusion is chapters 20 through 21. So that's the book of John. Then, you know, boom, we get into the book of Acts. Introduction. The Acts of the Apostles is the second part of Luke's history. It was written so we would have the true story of how the Christian church began and grew. And this is a very important book in the Bible, guys. This book especially tells about the work of 2 of the apostles, Peter and Paul. Peter is the central person involved in beginning the church in Jerusalem, and Paul is the important missionary who went out to nearby countries to tell others about Christ. We have a lot of Bible studies on the Apostle Paul and the letters that he wrote to the different churches and just different things about him. So he was very instrumental in this as well, right? So went out to nearby countries to tell others about Christ. Acts can also be called the Acts of the Holy Spirit because it teaches about the coming and work of the Spirit, you know, who is very important in our life, right, guys? Okay, so back to this book. The book of Acts teaches 3 things about the early church. 1, what the message of the early church was. 2, how the Jews rejected this message and how God sent the apostles to the Gentiles who accepted the gospel. And 3, how the early church was treated by the local and Roman governments. Outline the contents because it's 28 chapters. Chapter 1 is Christ's parting instructions because he was taken up into heaven, and then Matthias, you know, was chosen to replace Judas and stuff. Chapter 1 going into 8 is the church in Jerusalem. Chapter 8 going into 12 is expansion in Palestine. 13 through 14 is Paul's first missionary journey. The council at Jerusalem is 15. 15 through 18 is Paul's second missionary journey. And then 18 through 19 is Paul's third missionary journey. And then Paul in Jerusalem and Caesarea is 20 through 26. 27 through 28 is Paul's mission in Rome. So that's Acts, guys. After Acts is Romans. It's Romans. And introduction for Romans. This letter was written by Paul to the church in Rome in AD 56 or 57 as he was finishing his third missionary journey. Paul had hoped to first go to Jerusalem and then on to Rome and Spain. He probably wrote this letter in preparation for his visit. The theme of this letter is righteousness. Paul teaches in this letter that, number 1, no human being is righteous. Number 2, Jesus Christ is perfectly righteous. Number 3, we have faith in Jesus. We are freed from the power of sin, given a new life, and returned to a right relationship with God. And number 4, we should live Christian lives that are holy and pleasing to God. So to outline the contents, guys, this has 16 chapters. Introduction is in chapter 1. Chapters 1 continuing on going into 3 is no one is righteous. Righteousness through faith is chapters 3 through 8. Chapters 9 through 11 is Israel and God's plan. Chapters 12 through 15 is Christian living and relationships. And conclusion ingredients is 15 through 16. And it talks about some other things, like as you read it. So that was Romans, guys. Get some water. Next, guys, is 1 Corinthians, because there's 1st and 2nd. Introduction for 1 Corinthians. This letter was written by Paul to the church in Corinth, probably in the winter of AD 55. It was while he was in Ephesus that he sent, because there is a letter to Ephesus, the Ephesians, which is called the book of Ephesians, right? But it was while he was in Ephesus that he sent this letter in response to a letter from the Corinthian church. Located on the Mediterranean, the city of Corinth was a wealthy trading center. It was also a wicked city and was known for that throughout the Roman world. Because the church in Corinth was new, it was hard for the Christians there not to act like their neighbors, so the church had some problems. The Christians in Corinth were not getting along with one another. They were taking sides. Some of them were living very sinful lives. Paul wrote this letter to scold them and teach them how Christians should act. He tried to teach practical lessons about the Christian life so that people in Corinth would know right from wrong. And it has like 16 chapters, you guys. Chapter 1 talks about greetings and thanksgiving. Also, chapters 1 going into 4 is divisions in the church. 5 through 6 is sexual immorality and lawsuits. Marriage is talked about in 7. Christian rights and responsibilities is chapters 8 through 11. Christians in public worship is chapter 11, continuing on. Chapter 12 through 14 talks about place and importance of spiritual gifts. 15 is the resurrection of Christ and believers, and 16 is conclusion. So that's 1 Corinthians. Now we're going to get into 2 Corinthians. And guys, like I said, at any time if y'all need to pause, you can. I'm not trying to go fast. I'm not trying to go slow. I'm just trying to keep it steady because we got so much to cover. So, but at any time for y'all taking notes or anything, you can pause the video or you can always come back and replay it. Okay, so guys, 2 Corinthians is introduction. The letter known as 2 Corinthians seems to have been written a few months after the first letter. The divisions and problems that were present in 1 Corinthians were still in the church at Corinth. Paul himself may have made a quick trip to Corinth but left rather quickly because some of the members in the church there refused to change or believe that Paul was an apostle of God. Because remember, he did used to persecute the Christians, but God was raising him up for something greater, to be a Christian, and a lot of great things Apostle Paul did. So different people had different beliefs about Paul, but he didn't let that stop him from doing what God was calling him to do. So let's get back to this book of Corinthians, the introduction. After returning to Macedonia, Paul felt much better when Titus brought him the good news that the people in the Corinthian church had seen their problems and sins and were willing to change. It was at this time that Paul wrote his second letter to the Corinthians. The first part of this letter tells how happy and thankful Paul was when he heard that the Corinthians were sorry for the way they had acted and were now trying to live the way God wanted them to. In the second part of the letter, Paul defends himself against the people who were angry with him and who were saying untrue things about him. So it's 13 chapters. Chapter 1 is introduction. Chapters 1 going into 7 is Paul as God's messenger. Chapter 8 through 9 is generosity and giving. 10 through 13 is Paul as an apostle, and conclusion is in chapter 13. And it talks about other things as well. So that's 2 Corinthians, you guys. After 2 Corinthians comes the book of Galatians. Introduction. Paul wrote this letter to the Christian churches in the Roman province of Galatia. These churches were being confused by false teachers called Judaizers, who were teaching the Gentile Christians that they were not really saved unless they obeyed all the Jewish laws, such as circumcision, eating special foods, and celebrating Jewish feast days. This group also said that Paul did not have God's authority and therefore was not to be listened to. Paul begins the letter by telling the Galatians what gospel it is that he preaches and that his authority is from God. We cannot be saved from our sins by obeying the law. We are saved only by believing in Jesus Christ, Paul adds. Christians are free to live by the law of love, not the law of Moses. Faith, says Paul, must be shown in love, and believers must live by the Spirit. So guys, outline the content for this because it has 6 chapters. It's fairly short, but it has a lot of power points and a lot of good nuggets in the book of Galatians. It really does. So like chapter 1 is introduction. Chapter 1 going into 2 is Paul's authority from God. Chapters 3 through 4 is legalism versus God's grace. Chapter 5 through 6 is the gospel in practice. And conclusion is also in chapter 6. Ephesians, guys, is the next one. And we're almost done. We have some more after this, but we've actually covered a lot today, guys, in these videos. So I thank God. Pray somebody be blessed, you know. Ephesians, guys, is the next one, introduction. This letter was written by Paul during his 2-year imprisonment in Rome, about AD 60, because he was in prison a lot, but he didn't let that stop him, right, guys? This letter probably was sent not just to the church at Ephesus, but to all the Christian churches near Ephesus. Ephesus was a large, important city at that time, so it was a natural center for the Christian churches. One of Paul's themes in Ephesians is that of unity and God's purpose to bring all things in heaven and on earth together under one head, even Christ. Because of this unity, Paul wrote, because of this unity, not disunity, but this unity, just in times how I talk. But because of this unity, Paul wrote, all Christians are one family in Jesus, and they should act with love toward each other. He gives believers instructions on how to live a life of love by addressing the husband, wife, parent, children, and slave-master relationships. In this letter, Paul also writes about the church. Not a church building in a certain place, but the church that is made up of all Christians who have ever lived. Excuse me, guys. We call this the church universal. He compares Christ's relationship to the church, to the body, a building and a wife. So it's 6 chapters. Outline the contents. Chapter 1 is greetings. Also, Christ in the church is chapters 1 through 3. Conduct of the believer is chapters 4 through 6. And the Christian's warfare is chapter 6. In conclusion. So that's Ephesians, guys. After Ephesians is Philippians Introduction. Philippians as well as Colossians, Philemon, and Ephesians was written by Paul while he was in prison in Rome about AD 60. The Philippians had sent Epaphroditus to Paul with a gift. While Epaphroditus was in Rome, he became sick, and the Philippian Christians were worried about him. After he was better, Paul sent him back to Philippi with this letter. Paul's strong feelings of love for the Philippians is felt throughout this letter, and this is the most personal of Paul's letters written to a church. Paul tells of his thankfulness for the love and helpfulness of the Philippians. Even though Paul was writing from prison, this letter is full of joy. The words joy or rejoice are used 14 times. Paul here gives his own testimony to the meaning of his present life when he writes, "For me to live is Christ and to die is gain." A lot of people quote it, but if you get the context of why he said it, you'll see why he said it. And that's chapter 1, verse 21. As in his other letters, Paul gives words of encouragement and instructions for living in harmony with others in obedience to God. So it's like 4 chapters. Introduction is chapter 1. Also, Paul's circumstances and concern. Chapter 2 talks about imitating Christ's humility and Paul's messengers. Chapter 3 and 4 is warnings and advice and conclusion, also in chapter 4. So that's Philippians, guys. Sorry about all these notifications, guys. Okay, so that was Philippians. So Colossians, guys, is next. Introduction. Colossians is the 3rd letter written from prison in Rome about AD 60. Epaphras had come to Rome and told Paul that there were false teachers in Colossae who were telling the people that the Christian faith was incomplete. They were teaching the Colossians to worship angels and to follow special rules and ceremonies. Paul wrote to the Colossians to oppose these false teachers. He reminded them that Jesus is supreme over everything, that his death is all we need to save us from our sins, and that through him we are free from man-made rules. So it's 4 chapters, guys. For outline of contents, greetings and appreciation is chapter 1. Christ and the believer is 1 through 2. 2 is dangerous rules. 3 through 4 is rules for holy living. Greetings and conclusion is chapter 4. That's Colossians. Guys, this thing is about to cut off soon, so we're going to have to conclude the last part from, I'm going to tell you guys, 1 Thessalonians, going on to Revelation, and we're almost done. But I'm leaving everything that we did in the description boxes as far as like what books we came from, because we're going in order.